So I'd like to, first of all, introduce our first speaker. This is Professor Hayden McRobbie. Hayden's been working in the tobacco control area for quite a while, and we know him well in New Zealand. He also has a role with Queen Mary College in London, if I understand. Yep. So I've been told to keep the introduction short. So I'd like to, first of all, bring Professor McRobbie up.
David, thank you very much for that kind introduction and short introduction. I'm not one for a big, long introductions. So I'll just start off with declaration of competing interests. And I just want to highlight, I suppose, what I think is probably the most relevant conflict of interest statement here, which is a belief, of course, that vaping can make an overall positive contribution to public health. Some might argue that's not really a conflict of interest, but it is when you're talking about these sort of fields, not just all about financial conflicts of interest. Now, my views and practices to start off with. I'm both a researcher but also a clinician. I work at Counties Manukau District Health Board, so in a very deprived area of New Zealand, South Auckland, where we see a lot of very highly dependent smokers who have tried many times to quit in the past. So this is nothing new, but the best thing, of course, anyone who smokes can do to improve their current and future health is to quit. And I discuss what is on offer and what I can offer people to help them quit smoking. But we do see some people that either can't quit, they've tried everything in the past, or perhaps won't, and still want to use nicotine long term. So I provide information about what we currently know about vaping. And I try and give an evidence-based approach to this. And for those who choose to switch from smoking to vaping, I support them to do so. So there'll be a number of people that don't want to use NRT, nicotine replacement therapy, or Champix, or Zyban, or nortriptyline. So this is another option for people. So very quickly, just an overview for those that perhaps know just a little about e-cigarettes. And I'm going to try and use vaporizers here. I'm trying to change my language a bit these days. E-cigarettes kind of have connotations with tobacco industry, perhaps. Personal vaporizers or vaping is a little bit different. It's certainly not tobacco use. But there are a range of different products. Many of you will know the cigar-like devices here. Actually, a lot of my patients refer to these as e-cigarettes and these as vaporizers. Yet they're all the same sort of thing. They all have similar components. They all contain a battery, a tank or a cartridge to hold the liquid, which may or may not contain nicotine, and a heating coil which produces the vapor. In these, whether it's in a cartridge or contained, or whether you're adding e-liquid or liquid to the device yourself, it typically comprises of a mix of propylene glycol and vegetable glycerin. The ratio between these, of course, can change. Nicotine concentration may vary from none to perhaps up to about 36, maybe even higher, and the volume. So this is what you'll be looking at in these bottles. New Zealand dollar amounts here. This is just a quick look at a website which shows that you can buy a 30ml bottle of e-liquid for 25 New Zealand dollars, so much cheaper than smoking. Now, who are vaping? These data are from the UK, and I'm just showing you UK data because it's probably the best. We don't have good data in New Zealand in terms of current vaping. But here you can see in smokers and adult smokers, ever tried e-cigarettes or vaporizers, around 60%. Most recent data, that should say 2017, apologies for that. And then there's current use, which is different. There are lots of people that try these products, but relatively fewer go on to use them regularly. Reasons for vaping, depending on who you're looking at. If you're looking at vaping in current smokers, one of the most common reasons given is to help them reduce the amount they smoke, but not stop completely. If you look at vaping ex-smokers, i.e. people that have stopped smoking completely, then that's the biggest category there to help stop smoking completely. Now, I really want to talk about some of the concerns, and this is something we've gone through in New Zealand recently in addressing these concerns. I'll come on to the New Zealand regulatory environment later on. But these are probably the most common concerns that you'll hear. No proof that vaping helps people quit smoking. It's a gateway to smoking. There are all these toxicants in vapor, and of course they're highly addictive because they contain nicotine. So I'm just going to show you some data addressing these points. First, let's look at uptake of vaping in children and non-smokers, okay, because this is a legitimate concern. We obviously don't want never smokers who would otherwise not have gone on to smoking vaping. But this is the sort of stuff you might see online. In fact, I was trying to look for some pictures here, and this came up. Tobacco use, increase in e-cigarette use by high school students, increasing 900%, and the proportion of 11 to 17-year-olds who think e-cigarettes are less harmful than smoking. Well, a couple of points here. First, vaping is not tobacco use. We're talking about nicotine use, and although most nicotine comes from tobacco, you can manufacture nicotine in other ways, but this is not tobacco use. Now, this is very different. And yes, you have seen an increase in use, but if you look carefully at the data, this is ever use or experimentation. And as years have gone by, there have been more kids that have tried these once or twice. Some of you here have probably tried vaping once. Well, you're an ever user. And as to the last point, well, smart kids, because the evidence is that e-cigarettes or vaporizers are less harmful than smoking. Now, just looking at the data, now these are from 5 UK surveys, totaling over 60,000 young people. And this is just looking at ever smoking and regular smoking versus ever vaping and regular vaping in these cohorts of young kids. Kids try stuff, and you can see there that experimentation with smoking is very similar to experimentation with vaping. When you're looking at ongoing or regular use, it's much lower proportions. Now, the next question you might be asking, well, this is just lumping all young people together. What is the difference between never smokers and smokers? So this is what you can see here. And on the left of the screen, you're looking at never smokers' ever use of e-cigarettes or vaporizers, and never smokers' weekly use. Now, if you look at regular use in never smokers, they're under 0.05%. Seems there are some young people that do vape that don't smoke, but these are very low numbers. If you're looking at use of vaping in smokers, you can see it's much higher. So it's mostly smokers that are vaping. And this is very much the same in adult population. Now, these are data from the Smoking Toolkit study in the UK. And if you just look at the bottom two solid lines, so this is looking at adult never smokers using e-cigarettes in the blue or using nicotine replacement therapy in the green, almost identical. Yes, some never smokers seem to chew gum for whatever reason. So use is mainly confined to smokers, not never smokers. And the question is, well, is vaping a gateway to smoking? So here, could you get people hooked on vaping, and would that lead to them going on to smoke tobacco? Now, if you look at the longitudinal studies, and this was a meta-analysis published this year, it shows an association, i.e. those who try vaping are also more likely to try smoking at a later point in time. So again, the association here, and this is important, there is an association, but that doesn't imply causation. And you probably know better than I do, working in the fields that you do, that actually demonstrating gateway is quite a difficult task. Some more recent longitudinal studies say exactly the same thing. In fact, nearly all longitudinal studies show that kids that try vaping also try smoking. These two from the UK make it quite clear here that causality cannot be demonstrated on the basis of these studies. But it's something to watch out for going forward, and so monitoring outcomes is certainly important. Another concern, might vaping undermine quitting? And perhaps this came from advertisements like this out of the US, why quit when you can switch to blue, a type of vaporizer, first generation electronic cigarette? Well, it's people that switch completely are quitting tobacco use. They are quitting smoking. And I think there's been some confusion here about what this all means. Yes, they're still using nicotine, but ongoing nicotine use is never part of tobacco control. It's the tobacco, that's the smoke that kills people, not the ongoing nicotine use. I think we really need to be clear on this. Somehow I think this has shifted to now being having nicotine-free societies. It's not nicotine that kills people. Anyway, there are data, this is a meta-analysis published in Lancet Respiratory Medicine last year, that seem to suggest that actually vaping might undermine quitting. But there's some problems with the studies that are all lumped into this meta-analysis, and the biggest problem with this is that they recruited smokers and then asked them whether they'd used e-cigarettes. Now, the problem here is that smokers that are helped by e-cigarettes are no longer in the sample because they're not smoking anymore. And so you're almost weeding this out. You're only left with the people who are currently smoking who didn't find e-cigarettes helpful. Now, that's a completely different kettle of fish. And we see the same with nicotine replacement therapy. Those that found nicotine replacement therapy helpful stopped smoking. Those that didn't carried on. So you've got to be very careful when looking at these data. Really, the only way of looking at this is to define your outcomes a bit more carefully. Now, if we look at data from randomized controlled trials, these are from the Cochrane review, and there are only 2 randomized controlled trials that meet the inclusion criteria for Cochrane at the moment. There are more underway. But when you pull the data from these trials, comparing nicotine-containing vaporizers versus non-nicotine-containing vaporizers, it increases long-term quit rates, roughly doubling the chances of quitting. In terms of are e-cigarettes as good or similar to nicotine replacement therapy, only one study that's compared these so far, and the sample size is really too small to make any comparison there. Population studies, though, are starting to demonstrate what we might expect happen. These are data from the US, and what you're looking at here are annual cessation rates across the population. And you can see there between 2001 and 2010-11, the population quit rates have been very, very stable. And then in 2014-15, you see this significant increase in quit rates. Now, if you're looking at just the 2 white bars on the end of the slide there, if you're looking at people that quit or used e-cigarettes, their quit rates were higher than those that didn't. So there's some suggestion here, actually, that e-cigarettes are contributing to population quit rates. Not magic cures. You can see the population increase is not that great, but it looks pretty promising. But the regulatory environment is important here, and perhaps unfortunately in Australia, your regulatory environment is very, very conservative. If you look, these data are showing from the UK, people that quit smoking using a vaporizer compared to those that quit unassisted, cold turkey quitting, were more likely to have stopped smoking. In settings where it was more conservative, Australia and Canada at the time, Canada's changed somewhat now, then people that use vaporizers were less likely to quit smoking. Now, what about this concern that nicotine is highly addictive? Well, a few things to point out here. Actually, very few never smokers who try e-cigarettes become regular users. And actually, e-cigarette users report that they feel less dependent on vaporizers than they do on e-cigarettes. Now, possible reasons for this, that e-cigarettes are still not as good as smoking. Smoking still is the best way of delivering nicotine. And I think it's also important to remember there are other substances in tobacco smoke that are likely to potentiate the rewarding properties of nicotine. So, tobacco smoke is a mix of a whole lot of different things. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, for example, are present in tobacco smoke and might potentiate the addictive potential of nicotine. Now, e-cigarettes, vaporizers can deliver nicotine, but the amount delivered to the user depends on a number of factors. These are not medicines. And concentration of nicotine in the liquid is important, but you can use low concentration of nicotine and still get quite high blood nicotine levels depending on how you vape. Other constituents in the liquid may also be important. For example, the ratio of propylene glycol to vegetable glycerin may have an impact on how much nicotine you get. The heating of the liquid, the device that you use, and the technique of the user. Now, these are data from our lab in London. I quite like doing PK studies. They're always fun, except involve a very early start. This is going to work here. This blue line is blood plasma nicotine from smoking. So these were people that were both vaping and smoking. And then we ran them through a whole lot of different devices. You can see there the next best one was this Views product, which is 48 milligrams of nicotine per mil. So it's a fairly high concentration of nicotine, followed by the Nicotine, which is this tank system. So again, lot sort of around this area. This is where you might expect to see the peak plasma concentration of 4 milligram nicotine chewing gum, except not as fast. The peak's not reached until about 20 minutes of use. So again, still not as good as smoking. Now, what about safety? Well, there's concerns about nicotine, and yes, there are some adverse effects from animal models of nicotine per se in pregnancy and development of the adolescent brain. Nicotine is addictive, there's no denying that, but when you're talking about smokers, they're already addicted to the substance. It is toxic in high doses, probably more than we think. It was always the figure of 60 milligrams was enough to kill someone. The LD50s, somewhere between 6 and 12 milligrams per kilogram. So you're really talking about large amounts of nicotine needed to kill someone. And then there are some concerns, of course, around the effects of inhaled nicotine on some respiratory illnesses, for example, cancer and COPD. They're theoretical risks, though, at the moment. Toxicants have also been found in vapor from the aldehydes, acrolein, which is a carcinogen, metal and silicate particles, which come from the atomizers. There are situations where you can generate very high levels of formaldehyde if you operate these devices to very, very high temperatures. People who vape don't do this because it tastes disgusting. You get this dry puff, so they just avoid it. I think when you're looking at these data, and given that we're talking about most use is in people who smoke, then your comparison is not breathing fresh air. Your comparison really has to be smoking. That is, that is, to me at least, the most logical comparison. And when you look at these data, compared to smoking, the toxicants in e-cigarette vapor are very, very low overall. Now, this is just to look at comparison of some of these things. This is quite a nice study published this year. I know the table's very busy, but they compared, this is the proportion, these figures here are percentages, of these agents, so nicotine, NNK, which is a carcinogen, acrolein as well, compared to smoking. And if you look here overall, if you look at NNK, this is NRT users only, 11.6% of that you'd see in smokers, and even lower in vaping, in these samples at least. If you look at nicotine use, 135% compared to smoking using NRT only. This is quite typical of long-term NRT users. They get very good at using the NRT, and they can extract quite a good amount of nicotine out of it. In terms of cancer risk, these are some modelling data, again comparing it to smoking, and it's not that it's without risk, but it's very similar in estimates here to the nicotine inhalator, which is a nicotine replacement therapy. I guess we have to be uncomfortable at the moment, or we have to be comfortable with being a little bit unsure about exactly what the level of risk is. The Royal College of Physicians report said, yeah, actually, we probably agree with Public Health England that it's somewhere around 95% safer than smoking. Some probably, the real risk is probably, especially for cancers and COPD, less than that. For cardiovascular disease, it might be a little bit more. I think all we can say at the moment, though, is, look, these are significantly less harmful than smoking. Now, we won't know the exact degree of risk until we've got many years of population use. We do have 10 years of use in the UK where they've been used a lot, and so far, so good. What's not so good is the public perception of harm. And if you look at this timeline, these come from the UK ASH survey, YouGov survey. And if you just look at the blue bar, which is talking about a lot less harmful than, more or equally harmful than cigarettes, that back in 2013, you had 7%. By 2017, it's increased to 26%. How does that happen? Now, why is it that public are perceiving these as just as harmful or more harmful than smoking? There is nothing as harmful as smoking. So maybe we have some work to do here in some of our public health campaigns about giving people accurate information about vaping. It's not harmless, but it's certainly many times less harmful than smoking. Now, the UK is really moving forward in this harm reduction field. Their report towards a smoke-free generation certainly acknowledges the role of these vaporizers and other novel nicotine delivery systems and how they might play a role in harm reduction here. New Zealand's legislation is also changing and will incorporate a harm reduction approach. Now, for those of you from New Zealand, you'll know this already, but currently the supply and sale of nicotine-containing vaporizers is unlawful. So you can't currently sell these products, but you can import them for your own personal use, which is typically what people do. They just order them online and they come in from overseas. Now, the plan is to change this to legalize the sale and supply of nicotine-containing vaporizers with appropriate controls. And the appropriate controls are proposed, and this still has to go through parliamentary process, of course, yet the next step will be our select committee hearings early next year. But it will be to legalise the sale of nicotine-containing vaporizers and liquids as consumer products. It won't be medicines. Sale will be prohibited to under 18s. And actually, the legislation is about sale and supply in a public place. So that means that parents could legally give their adolescents who smoke, for example, e-cigarettes without being prosecuted. It's sale and supply in a public place. That's the key thing there. They'll allow point-of-sale displays, so you'll be able to display your e-cigarettes at the point of sale, not behind closed doors like tobacco is currently. R18 retail settings will be allowed to promote the products. There will be prohibition of broader advertising, though, and you won't be able to vape in places where you can't smoke. There's also going to be a set of requirements for product safety and a regulatory framework that will be developed, and we're starting on that now. I guess for clinicians, these are some of the questions that you're going to be asked by people. What about these e-cigarettes? Are they safe? Will it help me quit? Colin Mendelsohn and Coral Gartner are going to be running a workshop tomorrow, which I'd encourage you to go along to if you're interested in knowing what to say about these particular products. For me, it's quite simple. Are they safe? Well, they're not 100% safe, but they're safer than smoking. So for smokers switching, we're talking about a harm reduction approach. For people that have never smoked, then obviously there's going to be some increase in risk. The degree of that risk we just don't know yet. Will they help me quit smoking? Well, they deliver nicotine. They relieve tobacco withdrawal symptoms. I have no doubt that they will help some people quit smoking. Are they a magic cure? We don't have any of those in this field, as all of you well know. This is a good video. NCSCT in the UK have a number of different films. This one has a range of experts talking about e-cigarette safety and going through some of the data that I've presented today. So do have a look. So just in conclusion, there's so much literature coming out now, and it's difficult to sort of tease out the good from the bad sometimes. But I think what we do know is they are safer than smoking. I think there's broad public health consensus about that. The exact degree of risk, yes, we still have to be a little bit comfortable with the unknown. I think the current evidence shows that allowing better access to vaping is going to be associated with net public health gain, but we do need ongoing monitoring to assess any emerging problems and how to deal with those. Thanks. Happy to take any questions.